This wouldn't happen without SCORE. So we are excited to be hosting them and back to our in-person presentations. So please join in on the conversation, and I'm just going to turn it on over to Tricia.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. So as you see, we're going to be talking about the Heart of Daring Leadership today, which is based on Dr. Brene Brown's research over a 3-year data collection, which entailed 150 C-level leaders. And she partnered up with Rice University, Northwestern University, and University of Pennsylvania in doing her research, which all contributed to her book, Dare to Lead. And so what we're going to talk about today is the premise of the Heart of Daring Leadership. And so just a bit of an overview of who I am. So I am also a coach in the area. I have a coaching practice that really emphasizes leadership development. I work with individuals, I work with teams, I work with, and I work with groups. So I do a little bit of everything, but it's all centered around leadership development, which is what brought me to Brene. Started working with Brene's team in 2017, I believe, as a consultant / facilitator with the Daring Greatly book. There's a curriculum that goes along with that, so on and so forth. And then Dare to Lead came out, and then I jumped on that pipeline, and I've started doing Dare to Lead as well. So as you, if you know anything about Brene, she has several books. She's working on another now, but nonetheless, we're going to speak about her her latest, which is Dare to Lead. So Dare to Lead, what exactly is Dare to Lead? Dare to Lead is the goal, in the overarching theme of Dare to Lead is to provide specific tools and practices and behaviors so that we can actually infuse those into our leadership, whether it be personal leadership, whether it be team leadership, whether it be organizational leadership, and I also say home, because there's leadership that also takes place in your home front. So we're going to talk from that perspective. We're going to talk about the heart of daring leadership. And what I realized when we're talking about leadership, we very seldom talk about the heart of leadership, but we're going to talk why, we're going to speak to why we actually talk about the heart of leadership. The other thing about Dare to Lead is that it's in Brene's research, she found that it was easier for folks to talk about what daring leadership is not versus what it actually is. And so we're going to speak to that as well. What she has developed is a concept of 4 courage skill building skills that are teachable, observable, and measurable. So that takes us to, how do we actually cultivate an environment where people can show up, be brave, and lead bravely, where they're actually leading from the heart and not from protection. And so with that, as I said a few moments ago, we very seldom talk about the heart of leadership when we're talking about business and leadership. But what she has purported is that we have to start to realize that we are feeling beings that occasionally think versus thinking beings that occasionally feel. So we have that a bit backwards, which is why we're not talking about the heart of daring leadership or the heart of leadership when we're actually talking about business practices, traditional business practices. So there's 3 things or 3 tenets of daring leadership that that really encompasses the whole concepts of the 4 skill sets collectively. The first is that you cannot get to vulnerability you cannot get to courage without rumbling with vulnerability. And essentially here, vulnerability is the cornerstone of all of the skill sets. So if we're not rumbling with vulnerability, we really can't do much of anything else. And I think that we can all collectively say in this space that we've stepped into a moment of courage. Yes, no, yeah. And so when we step into a moment of courage, it requires some level of vulnerability. And so without rumbling with vulnerability, we really can't get to courage. So what has been found is that leaders must either invest a reasonable amount of time attending to people's fears and feelings, or you're going to squander an unreasonable amount of time trying to manage ineffective and unproductive behavior, which is what we see from a lot of leaders who are not tending to people's feelings. So the 3 tenets of Dare to Lead also includes who we are is how we lead. And essentially what that means is that self-awareness and self-love matters. when we're neglecting those things, they actually do come out in leadership, in the way in which we're guiding and leading people. So often, people are reacting to situations in place of responding to situations because there's a detachment with their level of self-awareness. At least one of the things that I'm learning much more so in my own leadership journey in terms of guiding people and helping organizations is one of the main cornerstones that they're missing is understanding who they are in the presence of guiding and leading other people. It's really amazing when you really start to get to know people and have conversations with them, how little they really know about themselves, but yet they're charged with the gumption and the responsibility of leading other people. So this is why who we are is how we lead is so important, because you have to understand who you are in order to do that. And what happens is that people think that fear is the underlying blocker in terms of what it means to become a daring leader. And it's actually not fear, it's armor. And so what is armor? We're going to unpack what that is and what it looks like and how it comes up. But that's really the thing that gets in the way of people actually leading from a courageous standpoint. So what I always say to folks when I'm working with them is it's really, I really admire the fact that you want to grow your team and you want to create a stronger environment, but it's really advisable for you to do your own work. And you really know when people aren't doing their own work by the way in which they guide and direct other people and or don't do that. So this is why I usually come back to this. Yes, we can do leadership. We can do all of that kind of stuff. But if your self-awareness isn't where it needs to be, then it's going to be stalemate. So we need to do our own work, essentially. The next one is that courage is contagious. And again, I think this is one of those things that I think we can all attest to. When we witness someone in a courageous moment, and or they're sharing that moment with us, it gives us the opportunity and the freedom to also do the same. When you're dealing with someone who is showing up in a protected manner, we also do the same. So armor meets armor, essentially. So what we want to try to do is put that to the wayside and figure out how we can actually show up courageously and be who we ultimately want to be in the presence of self first and other second. So in order for us to do that, or when we do that, I should say, when we begin to do that, that's when you'll notice that people are actually able to engage in tough conversations. We're also able to give and receive feedback because, many of us are able to give feedback, but it's very difficult for us to receive feedback. So what we do and what happens when we level up and we increase our own level of courage, we're able to actually engage in the reciprocal conversations, the give and take. And so what will happen is that with courage, if we are coercing our teams to show up courageously, what we are essentially doing is we're trying to cultivate, or we'll aim to cultivate, an environment where we're encouraging people to show up bravely. We're also encouraging people to have tough conversations, to give and receive feedback, as opposed to really giving attention to armor when that shows up in spaces, because there's a lot of misnomers around what it means to be vulnerable, especially when it comes to work. So we're going to talk a bit about that. What I want to do is I want to challenge each of you before we continue here, is I really want you all to think of a way in which you can become a better leader. And this is on the front end of what we're going to talk about. So if you had to speak off the top of your head, what you could do to become a better leader, what might that be? Anybody want to share?
Become self-aware.
Okay, self-aware. Anyone else? Anything?
I would say share my thought process with my team.
Okay. Yes.
Better listener.
Okay.
He took mine. I was going to say listen without
Hey.
Yeah, but you add a listen without judgment, which is hard, right? Especially when we come from such a judgy culture. So it's really difficult. Okay, so you're going to remember that as we go through this. I'm not saying you're judgy. I'm just saying we come from a judgy culture. Let me correct myself. So armored leader versus daring leadership. So we're going to talk about that. So let's really talk about what it means to be an armored leader. So armored leadership, what that would look like is someone who shows up to spaces inauthentically. These are people that are in your, maybe they're in your presence or you're working under their leadership, but you never quite know who they are. You never quite are sure what they're thinking and feeling, because armored leadership show up to spaces with the 4 P's is what we call it: perfecting, pretending, performing, and pleasing. And and what I call them is chameleons. So they change according to whoever is in their presence. So this is where we might label them fake, or we might label them untrustworthy, whatever the case may be. But it really is armored leaders showing up to a space. They're not comfortable in their own skin to show up in terms of who they authentically are. Yes.
If they're showing up that way,
Uh-huh.
why do you still consider them leaders?
So it all depends on how you define leadership. That's a great question. So how we define leadership from the Dare to Lead perspective is anyone who takes responsibility in people and processes, sees potential in someone, and then grows that potential in that person. So we move away from the fancy office, the title that you have, the amount of money that you make, the power that you have. So we move away from that. So in our mindsets, from the Dare to Lead perspective, we would not deem that person a leader. But in large scale, we look at leaders, unfortunately, in terms of what their position is, right? So organizations, especially if you're coming from a hierarchy, you know what I'm saying? Hierarchy perspective. I always get stuck on that. So if you're coming from that power position, this is why we get stuck in that mindset. Does that answer your question?
No.
Okay.
So we're just having this conversation a little while ago.
Uh-huh.
There's a distinction between a leader
Uh-huh.
and a manager.
Okay.
There's a distinction between a title, which just is, to your part, it's a plug-in on an org chart,
Okay.
versus how you actually perform.
Uh-huh.
So you could have a, quote, leadership team,
Mhm.
unquote, but it's made up of managers,
Mhm.
not leaders.
Okay.
So if somebody is showing up with the 4 Ps and you rattle them off very nicely, and I don't remember them, the way in which you presented those 4 Ps, though, is somebody that is manipulating themselves
Mhm.
to fit a situation
Uh-huh.
versus taking situations as they are, as an honest, authentic, true leader
Mhm.
to either develop the people within that situation,
Yeah.
or to correct the situation and develop the people afterwards.
Mhm.
So again, my question is, why would you consider an armored leader
Mhm.
a true leader? I would consider them a manager.
Yeah. So I don't know if you're asking me why I would consider that.
In general,
Yeah. Why do we?
yes.
I mean, that's a great question. I think that we're all fondling with that. How many of you actually work for leaders like that, right? You don't have to raise your hand, but or have worked for people, right? Or have. Yeah. And so and this is what we deem as leadership, and this is why we're trying to course correct. So your point is well taken, for sure. The other thing is that in addition to what we had just talked about, armored leaders also show up where their thoughts, their emotions, and their behaviors are used to self-protect in place of helping conversations progress. So that's the other thing that you'll see in terms of an armored leader. Armored leaders actually drive perfectionism, and they foster fear and failure. So this is where sometimes if you're in a work environment, your anxiety might be elevated and you're not really sure why it's elevated, but it's elevated because you're working for a boss who's a perfectionist. In any event that there's any mistake or mishap that happens, you're not so sure what's going to come next because they're fostering that fear of failure in place of learning from a situation where something didn't work. So let's revisit and figure out how we can tweak this and course correct. So that's another thing that you'll see. The other thing you'll see with armored leaders are leaders who numb out. And unfortunately, we can all kind of identify with numbing out, especially with our cell phones. Sometimes you might find yourself on a cell phone and you don't even know what you're looking at this point because you've been on it for so long. So we can, and I'm talking that's occasion, but some of us do it to a fault. But sometimes you'll notice that leaders actually numb out. And so they, traditionally we numb out with substances, right? Alcohol, drugs, and that kind of thing. But there's other ways in which we numb out. And so you'll find that armored leaders will also numb out as well. The other thing about armored leadership, and I'm unpacking armored leadership because we're going to move from it. We're going to actually talk about daring leadership, but I'm trying to paint the picture of what an armored leader looks like. An armored leader also looks like someone who has power over. So this is someone who drives from their actual title. And what I often say is, these are the folks who actually wear their badge of honor in terms of what their title is on their shoulder. So they lead from that position. So I'm all knowing. I'm the person who's running the organization. The last decision is my decision and that kind of thing. And they'll rule from that. And it may not be that vocal and in your face because we do have passive aggressive armored leaders as well, which actually slaps them when you at least expect it, which is even harder instead of it just being right in your face. The other thing about armored leaders is they show up in spaces as the knower. So you're running a meeting and you're having a collective meeting, and this is a brainstorming meeting, and the armored leader shows up and they know all. You say something much like the conversation, the back and forth we just had, the exchange. An armored leader would have to lead having had the last word or having had the last answer or trumping everything that you say. So these are the people who show up in the space as knower. So we're actually having a meeting and we're actually going to brainstorm, but you're going to listen to me. That's the kind of stuff that shows up in spaces. The other thing from armored leaders are they cultivate fitting in cultures. And if any of you can remember, your high school days in terms of the popular group and that kind of thing and what pain that brings on and not fitting in. And, we all have stories behind that, somewhat have stories behind that. So you'll also find the good old boy stuff still happening and that's what an armored leader does. So armored leaders are more often driven by their pride center of their brain, which is what we call the ego. Which is a trouble center because the ego really can get triggered in ways in which you can't even imagine if you're really dealing with an egoic leader. And so what happens is that's where the 4 Ps come in, right? And so depending on who's in front of them, they might just pull on a pleasing tendency just for the moment and then turn around and have a conversation after that, which completely goes against what they just said. The other thing about armored leaders is they're really disinterested in wholeheartedness. So these are the folks that when you're actually bringing feelings to the table, even though we are feelings being, there's no room or space for that. There's no space for feelings in the workplace. That's the kind of stuff that you'll hear them say. And typically, what you'll also know about armored leaders is they really want to do little work in terms of knowing who they are. If there's any inkling of vulnerability even going to touch them, they're going to run because they don't want to learn anything new about themselves that might force them to make change. Because remember, you can't change what you know. So now that I know something and I have to change something, this is the stuff that they'll push against. So what we want to actually talk about is we want to talk about daring leadership. So daring leadership is really based on the 4 skill sets of courage, which is rumbling with vulnerability, living into our values, braving trust, and learning to rise. And this is the premise of how we move people from armored leadership to becoming a daring leader. So how we define courage are people who end up doing things in the face of fear. So you forge through anyway. I'm feared about doing something and I'm going to do it anyhow. That's what we call courage. And sometimes what I find, at least in the work that I do, sometimes people think that people are either born a leader or they're not. People are either born with courage or not. You either have it or you don't, sort of thing. And what we've learned through Brené's research is that all of this can be taught, it can be learned, it's measurable. So we can actually teach people to do these things. Let's talk about the first skill set, which is rumbling with vulnerability. It's the foundational skill set. There are lots of misnomers with vulnerability, so we'll unpack some of that in a moment. But vulnerability is really our ability to stick in the messy middle of a conversation. So you're having a difficult conversation, a hard conversation. The hardest part of the conversation is the middle part. So that's when you will know whether or not someone is willing to rumble with vulnerability, is because they stay in the messy middle. They don't tap out of a hard conversation. And what I mean by that is they don't crack a joke. They don't stop the conversation. They don't change the course of the conversation. This is someone who sticks in the messy middle of a conversation. That's what you'll get with rumbling with vulnerability. It is a skill set and it is possible to practice, but just know that when we are rumbling with vulnerability, we're up against uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure, which is what people don't like. I mean, one of the main things that many of us run from is the unknown. And that's what vulnerability really is, because you really don't know what to expect. So when we talk about rumble, I do warrant you that if you're going to want to rumble with someone and you want to use this language, that you apprise them of what rumble means. You don't just go and use the word rumble. I had a colleague who did a training a couple months ago, and one of her participants went back to her job and asked her boss to rumble. She said, "I want to rumble with you." And she actually got written up because she didn't explain what rumble meant. So what rumble means is I want to engage. If you say to someone, I want to rumble with you, you're actually asking them to show up into a space authentically open and vulnerable. You're actually saying to them, I am about to engage in a hard conversation with you, and I'm asking for you to join me and be open as well. So that's what you're actually asking, and if you use rumble in the wrong community, it might be a fight. So you want to make sure that you are using rumbling with vulnerability in the right way. So what happens is that when you're inviting someone to this space, you're staying curious, you're staying out of judgment, which one of you said you feel like you could do better. You stay in the messy middle. You're able to give and receive feedback. Sometimes when you're in conversations and you're giving feedback, it's really hard for us to receive. One of the things that makes me laugh is I'm a truth teller. And sometimes literally in my personal life and my professional life, right, Jerry? I'm a truth teller. And oftentimes people say, just tell me the truth. I want to know the truth. And really, we really don't want to know the truth. We are asking for the truth. And oftentimes we're not ready for the truth. So I just say that when you're having these conversations, you want to be open and honest and say, are you wanting me to be honest? Or are you wanting me to pad what I have to say? Because sometimes people want to invite that and then they're really not ready. So that's really what vulnerability is about. You want to actually ask yourself, and just think about this moving forward. Are you actually able to engage in vulnerable conversations? Are you actually able to engage vulnerably with people? Because oftentimes what you'll find is that when you meet people, the first thing we seek out in other people is vulnerability. And the last thing we want them to see in us is vulnerability. That's usually the exchange that happens, which is oftentimes when you meet someone and you leave them, and if you allow them to be vulnerable and you learn about them, they think you're the greatest thing in the world. And you leave a conversation thinking like, oh my, what a dud. Maybe, hopefully you don't say that. But in the event that you do, oftentimes it's because you're the one that's closed down and you're not equally exchanging in the conversation. So let's do some myth busting. There's 6 myths to actual becoming vulnerable and what it actually means. The first one is vulnerability is weakness. People think that vulnerability is weakness, but if you really think about yourselves in terms of vulnerability, how hard is it? Really hard, right? Really, really difficult. So it's actually what Brene has found, it's the most accurate measure of courage. So what she has found is that she's given some examples of what that might look like. So when we go on interviews, right? When you go on an interview, very vulnerable. Maybe going to your boss and asking for a raise, very vulnerable. You don't know what you're going to get. Asking for help, which is one of the hardest things any of us can do, is ask for help. There's vulnerability in that, right? So the other thing is losing a job. We hear lots of people now losing their jobs, bless you, or have lost their job due to COVID. You're not prepared for that loss of a job. There's a lot coming with that. And even if you are prepared, meaning financially that you can live and be okay losing a job, there's still something with that, in terms of losing a job. Starting a business, staying in a business, and entrepreneurship, right, Anne? Right? So we think vulnerability is weakness. And personally, if you think of your personal life, like, asking someone out on a date, saying I love you first, asking for a divorce, these are hard things. So vulnerability is actually your most accurate measure of courage. The other one is I don't do vulnerability. Now, when this comes up with folks, I always say to them, listen, if you don't do vulnerability, vulnerability is doing you. And so you have to be mindful of what that looks like. And what happens is that if you're one of those people say you don't do vulnerability, you have to understand that you're probably functioning from a place of fear. And that's the driver of your thinking, feeling, and behavior. And there's a lot of mistakes that happen in that. So just recognizing what does vulnerability look like for you, because each of you will define it differently. What does that look like for you? And what does it trigger in you? Because it is uncomfortable. And it does get more comfortable the more you practice it. But just know that if you're saying, I don't do vulnerability, just know that it's probably doing you. The other thing is that the other myth is that I can go it alone. And I'm one of those people that I wish I could go it alone more often than not. But what we know is that we can't. We are neurobiologically wired for connection. We can't get away from it. And if we have not learned that now through COVID, we will never learn it. We've had a lot come out in terms of mental health awareness now. You've had a lot of people like, I just need to be around people, including our introverts. Even they wanted to be around people. So what we know is that we can't go it alone, and we need to be in connection with other people. The other thing is that we don't want to lose the idea of the reason why we're all here anyway is to connect. So when you're one of those people say, I don't need people, I don't want to be around people, I hate people, which I hear quite often, it's always a red flag. And I'm like, okay, there's something more going on here. there's definitely more that needs to be unpacked if the person's willing, of course. So the next one is, you can engineer the uncertainty and risk out of relational vulnerability the same way you can engineer out of systematic vulnerability. And I do warrant you to understand the difference, because there is definitely a difference. When you are trying to engineer everything out of, you're trying to engineer vulnerability out of a situation, just know that we're no longer talking about vulnerability. And remember, vulnerability allows us, when we are actually engaging in vulnerability, it allows us and invites us to connect with other people. So if we're engineering that out of a situation, then we're no longer connecting. We're actually pulling ourselves away, which goes against the very thing of what we want to do, which is connect. The next one is trust comes before vulnerability. So this is the chicken and the egg, right? So which comes first? So what we know about trust and vulnerability is that they grow together. And so to betray one is to destroy both. What we need is trust in order to be vulnerable, and we need to be vulnerable in order to trust. So they do grow simultaneously. So know that whether or not one comes before the other, we know that they work simultaneously in tandem. The next one, and the last one, is self-disclosure. This is one that people oftentimes get really mixed up with vulnerability, is they think that sharing everything is what we need to do in order to be vulnerable. We see a lot of this on social media. You know, we see a lot of it on, so people putting themselves out there on social media. Oversharing and self-disclosure for the sake of self-disclosure is not vulnerability. So just know that the vulnerability without boundaries is not vulnerability. And so when you're seeing that, know that there's something else going on. You have to have some level of boundary. The other thing I always warrant people to do is understand what your role is and your position is, especially if you're guiding and leading other people. Understand what that is in relation to being vulnerable, because you're not going to share the most egregious thing about a company with someone to be open. That's just not what your role is to do. So know that, you know, you have to have boundaries when you are being open with people, and understand the intention behind sharing. Is what I'm sharing with you progressing the conversation? Is what I'm sharing with you bringing us closer together for the greater good of the cause, whatever that might be? Or am I just sharing the hot wire connection for the moment, which are short-lived moments? The next skill set is living into your values. So how I reference values is essentially your values are your guideposts. And without these, when they're absent, when your values are absent, you're pretty much out of alignment. So sometimes you'll get people that say, you know, they'll say in general conversation, like, I'm off. I just don't know what's going on with me. I've been off for quite some time. Usually what happens in those moments are people are really removed from what their core beliefs are. So what's really true to you? What's really, what really works well for you? What do you say is your foundation? What is your belief system? Typically what you'll find is that people are moving away from that and they're out of alignment. And so what happens is you have to come back into alignment. Values do change. Just know that your values do change as we begin to age. They change. You can just look back 5 years ago. Are your values the same as they are now? Typically, you'll find there's like a 5-year process where they're changing and turning. So just keep that in mind. And there's also a difference between aspirational values and operational values. So you'll see that I have a poster on this on the one slide. So that is more of like an aspirational value. And if you have these, I'm not judging you, and I don't know that you have them, but I'm just going to talk to you to talk about them with you. So you go into a company and you see these aspirational values hanging up everywhere. And then people will say, oh yeah, these are our values. These are our business values. This is what we lead by. Then you're like, okay, did you define them out? Oh no, it's excellence. That just speaks for itself. Okay. And there's danger in that, because you might have 4 different employees that come out, ask each of them to define excellence, and everyone has a different definition. So we're aspiring to be excellent based on what your definition is. Right? So it's like the blind leading the blind, which is why we're proponents of operationalizing what your values are. So you say this is important. What's the behavior that actually supports that value so that you make sure you're in alignment with it? And typically what I say to people is, you don't have to really ask people questions. If you just sit back and watch how they move and what they talk about, they'll tell you who they are. You'll understand what their value system is if you really are listening. Right? You don't have to ask 50 million. You know, you ever meet that person and ask you like 50 million questions? You don't have to ask, just listen. And you'll know within the first 10, 15 minutes where a person stands and who they are. And they're letting you know what they value. They might not be able to tell you, but you might be able to tell them. So the point is that just getting in alignment with what's important to you. And when we move away from that, this is where we actually get out of alignment. And also in the form of leadership, when we don't know what we stand for and we're guiding and leading other people, that's scary. That's really scary. Because I'm going to tell you what's important, but I don't even know what's important to myself, right? So just keeping that kind of stuff in mind. We do some of this in terms of Dare to Lead. We actually teach people how to break this down and operationalize it so you can get more formalized in what you say is important. And this is where we come to where daring leaders are never silent about hard things. I'm a little on the fence about this because I think that never is an absolute. Now, absolutes always scare me, but I would say rarely are silent about hard things. And so something comes up in a space, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a very big hot topic now, right? So something comes up in a conversation and it creates maybe some level of discord in you. Are you speaking up in that moment or are you staying silent, right? So that's why I'm saying that sometimes we have to pick and choose. That doesn't mean that that your value is diminished or it's not relevant. It's just that you're picking and choosing. Am I responding? Am I reacting? And I can circle back to that comment. That's why I say sometimes it's hard when we go with these absolutes, but nonetheless, if you are in alignment with your value, you're at least speaking your truth. It may not be in the moment, but you will at least circle back and definitely speak to it. And the other thing about daring leaders is that they're not afraid. These are the folks that are not afraid to give and receive feedback. Now, even though you're a daring leader and you're receiving feedback, it doesn't mean that the feedback you're receiving is easy. It just means that you're open to receiving feedback as well, which takes us to braving trust. Interesting when I'm doing this work with folks and I'll ask out loud, do you trust yourself? Oh yeah, I trust myself. I don't trust anyone else. But what people fail to realize is that trust is a domino effect and trust always starts with you first. So if you don't trust other people, 9 times out of 10, you don't trust yourself as well. And also how you can see if someone trusts themselves or not is based on their indecision. So if they're decisive or not, So that also gives you an idea. If you're indecisive, 9 times out of 10, you really don't trust yourself. So you're able to make a decision, even though you know that decision might not be the best, but you're going to take a stab at it anyway. You're at least letting people know I trust this decision. And I also trust the fact that if it's not the right decision, we can pick ourselves back up resiliently. This is why we go into clear is kind and unclear is unkind. Sometimes you'll get people to say that, oh, I'm not going to say that because that's not nice. Is it the truth? Does it need to be said? Well, then clear is kind. That's the kind thing to do. So when we're keeping truths from people because we think that we're thinking for them, we're thinking you can't handle it, or we're thinking that you might take it the wrong way, we're in the wrong lane. So it's like getting back in your lane. Is this something that you think needs to be shared? Is this something that you think is going to be for the greater good of the cause? Then clear is kind, because being unclear is unkind. So something happens, right? You're in a situation, there's a decision that needs to be made. You didn't say anything, but you knew in your heart of hearts that it shouldn't have happened. It happened. Then all of a sudden it takes place. It's unfavorable. Now, all of a sudden you have weigh in. That's unkind. And that's what oftentimes you'll see, especially when we have leaders who are operating from armored leadership versus daring leadership, or they'll give you a project without direction. Oh, so you don't have any descriptions on what you're looking for? No, just do it. I trust that you'll do it right. Okay. And that's the kind of stuff that comes up. You're not being clear on the front end. And then after I give you the product, this isn't what I wanted. This isn't close to what I wanted. And now we have the shame storm happening, right? So that's why we talk about clear is kind. And this is where the 7-element acronym comes in about braving trust. So we actually break it down. This is another way in which you operationalize. So if you think about trust in terms of maybe someone has accused you of not being trustworthy. So they said you're not trustworthy, but they're not able to break down why you're not trustworthy. This is where operationalizing trust really helps. And or you might have said about someone else, I don't trust them, but you can't really unpack why you don't trust them. I just have that feeling. I don't know, but you're not really able to articulate the specifics in terms of why you don't trust this person. That's where operationalizing trust comes in, and it benefits all parties, the clearer we are. So what we know about boundaries first is that boundary starts with you, right? And let me say this to you in terms of boundaries. Boundaries is one of the hardest things, and I'm talking all age groups. It's one of the hardest things for people to practice. It's easy to profess, but it's very difficult to actually put into practice. So, and it is a practice, you know, and when you lack boundaries, you're letting people know you don't stand for anything. And that's where the weakness actually comes in, because then you get people who take advantage of you. So boundaries, what we actually suggest is for people to actually convey what's okay versus what's not okay. And you having to figure that out. And you might not know. So learning along the process, you know, if you don't really care about something when it initially starts and all of a sudden you're halfway in, you're like, you know what, I really don't like what's happening, then it's your responsibility to convey that and not just go along with things. So what's okay versus what's not okay is a very simple way of stating what your boundaries are, and it's your responsibility to do so. And I always advise people to really get out of the mind reading business. Like, really stop putting these expectations on people to read your mind. Oh, you've known me for 20 years. You should know that. That's like a backslap shame, right? You should know that. You should be keeping up with my life and yours. That's essentially what we're saying to people, not realizing that I have a life to keep up with, you have a life to keep up with, and we change. So it's my responsibility to keep you up to speed with what's okay versus what's not okay. And it also conveys in the business world, what's okay versus what's not okay on the front end. So you're not getting people that are doing things and all of a sudden 6 months in, you know, you've been doing this for like 6 months. It's not okay. Oh, okay, great. Now we're going to have a conversation. Which brings us to reliability. Reliability is repeated behavior, doing what you're saying you're going to do repeatedly. And again, I warrant people to be mindful of honeymoon phases. You know, honeymoon phases brings about joy and excitement and really intriguing. Oh, yes, this is great. But then after that, typically 90-day period, you know, typically after that 90-day period, you know, goes by the wayside. Now, all of a sudden it's like, oh, start taking things for granted now. You know, so within that first honeymoon phase, you're like you're on your game. You're looking good. You're feeling good. You're showing up to work early. You're getting involved in projects. And after you're there for 90 days, it's like, this is old business, right? So you want to be mindful of that. So what happens is you become unreliable, or you're interviewing and you're overselling. I just had this happen. You know, you say you can do something, and then 30 days in, I'm like, no, this is the wrong person. Well, now you have how much money down the drain. Right? So just being honest on the front end, you know, I'm not familiar with this, but I'm willing to learn. Okay. That gives me something to work with instead of overselling and under delivering. Because again, you're lacking reliability. So keep that kind of stuff in mind. Or the write-ups, right? Or your relationship is AWOL, or something goes wrong. Oh, I'm on the hot seat. Let me pay attention for 2 weeks and then I'll drop off, right? Let me get it right for 2 weeks. So you want to keep that kind of, because then what happens is you start losing credibility. The other one is accountability. So accountability is owning your stuff, right? Owning it, apologizing, and making amends. So it's not always easy for people to own they're wrong. You know, if they dropped the ball, if they've done something, if they missed an opportunity, it's not always easy for folks to do that. What's also not, sometimes it's very easy for people to apologize. So our over apologizers, you want to be mindful because you're lacking credibility, right? These are the people who want to apologize even for breathing. It's like, no, okay, you've apologized way too much. So it's okay. So is that you, Willa? So what happens with this is that recognizing that apology is not always necessary, and just recognizing that I've dropped the ball and I'll make my wrong right is enough. And the other thing is making amends. Sometimes what we do is we start thinking for other people, which is why it's hard for us to circle back to people and apologize, because we start thinking for them. Like if I go to make an amends and they don't accept it, that rejection, you know, so I'm just not going to do it. You know, that kind of stuff, which is vulnerability, right? So I'm going to go and make amends, but I don't know what to expect. So then I'm not going to do it at all. So I just warrant people to keep that kind of stuff in mind with accountability. And there is such a thing as over accountability. So keep that in mind. You want to be at that happy medium. The next one is vault, which is upholding confidence and keeping things confidential. So, you know, somebody shares something with you, it can stay with you. It's not going to go anywhere. There's one door on a vault, which means that what goes in a vault stays in a vault. But here's the thing that we forget. There's another side to the door on the vault. And these are people who try to hotwire connection. So you're at a business meeting, you're having a meeting, you're not in agreement with what's happening in the meeting, but you don't say a word. So then after the meeting's over, you go and have a meeting after the meeting. And this is where you start talking. And you start, right? And so maybe you're sharing it with me, and I may not agree with what you're saying, but I don't want to lose this bid for connection. So I'm just going to co-sign on whatever you're saying. That's the kind of stuff you want to be mindful of. Those are the bids of connection. That's where we hotwire connection, as opposed to, you know what? I hear you and I know, and I'm with you on that, but I feel much more comfortable if you bring that back into the next meeting, and I'll have your back if you bring it up, right? That's how that looks different. But what happens is that we mind that other side of the door and we hotwire connection, telling stories that are not yours to tell. Hey, do you know Jane's getting fired? That is not your story to tell, right? Even, hey, do you know George is getting a promotion? That's still not your story to tell, but we do this stuff all the time. So you just want to keep that kind of stuff in mind. That's the other side of vault, like making sure that the stories that you're sharing are yours to share and no one else's. The other one is common enemy intimacy. And this is where we connect on the basis of negativity. So we connect. So you and I might sit down and have a conversation. We can't stand each other, but we also don't like Jerry. So we're going to talk about Jerry together. And after we're done talking about Jerry, we're going to disconnect because we also don't like each other. So you also have to keep in mind that there's also that other side as well. So you want to just be mindful of the vault. There's a lot of things happening in vault. And there's also, like I said to you, if you just sit back and watch people, they're showing you who they are all the time. And this is one of those moments. Then the next one is integrity. There's 3 parts to integrity, which is choosing courage over comfort. And, we can't be courageous and comfortable at the same time. Can't happen. So number 1 is courage over comfort. Second one is choosing what's right over fun, fast, or easy. And whatever that might be for you and whatever situation you might be in, what's right given the situation over what's fun, fast, or easy. And the last one is practicing your value, not just professing, because we talked about values as the second skill set. So if you don't know what you stand for, you'll fall for anything. Or you'll have a value that you're not practicing, but you hold someone else to a different expectation than you hold yourself. So you want to be mindful of that. With integrity, you're not just professing that this is important, you're actually practicing it, which is where the operationalizing actually comes in. Non-judgment is the other piece of braving trust. And non-judgment in the way of if you receive value from being the giver in relationship, but you can't receive value by receiving, then you can't give without judgment. So non-judgment is about reciprocity. It's about the give and take in relationship. I'm able to give without judgment. I'm also able to receive without judgment. And that's how we create trusting situations. And that's how trust is actually built. So I'm able to do for you and you receive without all of the mockery. And then you're also able to give and do the same. So you want to be mindful of that as well. And generosity is last. Generosity is where we extend the most generous thoughts about people's words, intentions, and behaviors. And if something's off, we check in with them about it. So you're in conversation with someone, maybe at work or maybe a close friend, and they say something that hurts your feelings or offends you. You might not say something in the moment, and that's okay, but you at least circle back and you extend that generosity to the person. Like, hey, the other day you said X, Y, and Z. This is how I felt about it, but I wanted to check in with you because that's not typically how you are. And you give them space to actually explain it to you in place of holding a grudge or keeping it from them. You're actually extending that generosity. We're human. We say things and we do things, and just letting them explain themselves. So that's what it's about. It's not about being on the road. You have a road rager behind you honking the horn and you're like, pull over. I want to talk to you about your words, intentions, and behaviors for a moment. No, it's not that. This is trusted, connected relationships. So you want to keep that kind of stuff in mind. The last one is learning to rise. So learning to rise, you can't learn how to rise if you're not braving trust, if you're not leaning into your value, and if you're also not engaging in vulnerability. Doesn't happen. So the rise process is actually, it's the setback. So you're learning to rise when you are set back, because if you show up brave enough, often enough, you will fall. And if you're actually putting these skill sets into practice, there will be some falls. But the trusting part is that you're braving trust with yourself to know that I'm also charging myself with the skill set of resilience to build myself back up after I do that. And that's what the rise is all about. So there's a few things that you need to put in action when you're practicing the rise process. And the first one is getting curious. So in the moment of a fall, in the midst of a fall, or even after the fall, you want to get curious about what happened. What happened in this moment? So oftentimes what happens in the absence of data, we make up story. So in that, and we all do it. We all definitely do it. So you want to be mindful of that. So you want to get curious about what happened. So in that curiosity, you want to know what your part is. So what was my part in whatever went wrong? And then you also want to know what was the other person's part. So what's my part? What's their part? Because what happens is that if we're taking on too much, we don't know where to start unpacking. So you definitely want to know the difference of what theirs is, what yours is. And then you also want to reality check, because as I've said to you, in the absence of data, we make up stories. And it can be as simple as you start off your morning and we walk by each other at the water cooler and you speak to me and I'm in my own world and I don't speak back to you, you automatically make up a story. It could be very innocent and it can also be very serious. But the point is that when you fall, you want a reality check. What story am I making up versus what really did happen? And then that's going to help you with the revolution piece, which is, what can I actually learn from this mistake so that I can recharge and go back out and put these skill sets back into practice? Which brings us to the integration piece, which is the three-legged chair. We know we need all three legs in order to support the chair. And we use this as a metaphor in terms of daring leadership. So what we know for sure is that our thinking affects our feeling and our feeling affects our behavior. So we have to integrate all three pieces. So what we must do is engage them conceptually and paying attention to them and how they're showing up in spaces, whether it's in work, whether it's at home, whatever, or in play. Because Dare to Lead can change your life, both at work, home, and at play, if you put this into action. But what happens is that with daring leadership, when you're cultivating all three of them, what you're doing is you're actually forming a place of worthiness where it supports courage, compassion, and connection, as opposed to armor, where it's pushing people away. So that's really the difference. And that brings us back to who we are as how we lead. So what we know is that folks who practice vulnerability, so you're rumbling with vulnerability, you're living into your value by practicing it, you're braving trust. We know that these folks know how to rise because they've stacked themselves to do so. And so what happens is that they won't get stuck or hooked emotionally. What happens in this process is that emotional granularity is very important. What Brene found in her research is that on average, people have 3 words to express or to describe their emotions. That's not many. When we have a plethora language to describe our emotions, and on average, we have 3 words that we use to describe our emotions. So what happens is that when we get emotionally hooked, this is where it makes the rising process so much more difficult, because we're not really able to extrapolate what's happening. So what grounded confidence, this is what daring leadership brings us all to. Grounded confidence, where we're able to put down our armor and we're able to show up in spaces bravely. So what we do is we stay curious, we're able to rumble, and we do it all through a practice. And that brings me back to the last thing. And we started with, how can you become a better leader? And now, based on what we just talked about, has anyone's answer changed or response changed? No? Yes.
I like be clear. I think that that's such an important, especially in the workplace, is to be clear and to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And the quicker, you have conversations and people are clear and honest, the quicker things can move on and evolve and that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
I really resonate with the clarity aspect of Dare to Lead.
Okay. Thank you. Yes.
I'd like to kind of just riff on that a little bit. I like the clear is kind
Mm-hmm.
with the qualifier, and I like the qualifier if it needs to be said or done. Because so many people take, I have to be open and honest, and they take it, everything,
Yeah.
again, one of those absolutes.
Uh-huh.
I have to be open and honest about everything. No, you don't.
Right. Right.
If it doesn't need to be said and it doesn't need to be done, you don't need to be open and honest
Yeah.
about that. So I love that clarity, because it makes you stop. It should make you stop and think whether or not that needs to be said or needs to be done. And
Yeah.
then, once you've made that decision, once it passes through that checkpoint, if you will,
Yeah.
then to be very clear about it, very open and vulnerable and so forth.
Right. And I think to your point, both your points, is that it just creates so much more space for productivity versus cleanup, right? So you're not clear on the front end, then you got to go and clean up a lot of stuff, whether it be them, you, whoever, but there's a lot of cleanup on the back end. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, Willow.
I think something that's really important is that you're talking about at the beginning with vulnerability and kind of the rumbling with vulnerability, because I've seen with a lot of leaders, they tend to think that vulnerability is the weakness, and that it's, like you said, it's a very important aspect of being a leader, is being able to be vulnerable with yourself and the people that you're leading.
Right. Absolutely. And when you have those moments, it just makes for a greater connection, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyone else? Any questions? Yeah.
When you were talking about braving, you very briefly mentioned that you can have over accountability.
Yeah.
Would you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, those are the people that they're the profusive apologizers, profusive pleasers, always wanting to perfect and perform, how can I make it right? Really anxiety driven. Those are the folks that, and then what happens is you really don't know where they stand because they do it to a fault. And you're like, are you genuine? Is this, and unfortunately, most of them really are genuine, but it's genuine on the extremity, right? So it's like, how can we pull some of that back? You do want that present, but you don't want it to a fault where you have to like tease through it. Like, okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other questions? Any feedback? Okay. Yeah.
Sorry to ask for feedback.
You don't have to say sorry.
I'm one of those shy and silly people. Thank you all for laughing. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
No, I thought this was very well rounded, very, very fairly addressed. Alluded to a conversation that I had prior to this meeting. How do you see daring leadership rolling out into, let's just stick with corporate culture for the moment.
Yeah.
Rolling out into corporate cultures, especially in today's world. Because one of the things that I'm fearful for about corporate America is the fact that, especially post-pandemic, if we can claim that at the moment, they're demonstrating that they're much more closed off because they're still in a defensive position, rather than recognizing that their position becomes much better if they openly lead and exhibit all of the characteristics that you just described in this presentation. So how do you see that rolling out to a corporate America in today's current environment?
Yeah. Well, I will say optimistically, I have colleagues who have done training and it's been really, they've had lots of success. I'm currently stuck in a training that is really difficult. And what I'm finding is that if you don't have your top leader on board, it's very, very difficult because it starts from top down. Depending on, there's very little people operating from an egalitarian perspective. Once you start operating from that, and really putting these things into practice, it'll be much better. But because we're doing the traditional practices, as long as you have your top leader in the room, in training, along with everyone else, I think that it could be effective, but the person has to be present. So I won't do trainings without the CEO, the head person in charge in the room, because it just doesn't make any sense if it's not happening from top down. So we'll see what happens, but some people are really thirsty for change. They really are. I think that people are welcoming it. And I think that people underestimate the work that it takes to actually make effective change and the personal work, put business aside. It's really your person, because people neglect to realize that who you are at home is who you are at work in a lot of ways. And so they think, oh, I'm not like that at home. Malarkey, you are, so until they start recognizing that. But I'm optimistic. We'll see what happens. And I have lots of colleagues that are having very much promise in terms of what they're doing. It's a game changer. You're either on or you're not, you either get it or you don't. There's not a gray area here. You can't really, I'm in a training where someone's like, vulnerability is weakness and he won't let it go. Okay. You can't fight that. So, you have to be the decision maker over your own life. But it's unfortunate because it's going to affect the team. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you, by the way. This is amazing.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm really excited to take all this into my leadership role, but I'm wondering where does confidence fit into this? Because I feel like that's my setback. Maybe am I not trusting myself where I feel I can't speak,
Yeah.
even though I want to.
Well, I commend you on being able to even articulate that in front of a group of people. So thank you. And that's where I always say that self-awareness is primary, especially in this work too, is really understand getting grounded with you first. So getting grounded with you is going to make it easier for you to engage in the 4 concepts or 4 skill sets. But it's really figuring out, where are you lacking confidence? Why are you lacking confidence? Really unpacking that. So this is really about unlearning and relearning. So just recognizing where, and it might only show up in certain areas. So recognizing that, is it just in certain situations that I'm lacking confidence? Am I more confident here? And I'm a strengths-based coach, so I like to really expound upon your strengths. Some coaches will say, "Oh, let's really work on your weaknesses." That's just not my approach. I think that if you can increase your strengths, your weaknesses will come alive in a different way. So I don't know if it answers your question, but it's really delving in to you as a person. And there's reasons why, right? You don't have to tell us, but there's reasons why. Of course, there's always a story behind our stuff. Yeah.
I was going to say, I've read a few of Brene Brown's books, and Braving the Wilderness would be very good for that. I have a teenage daughter, and I made her read it. She was not thrilled.
Yeah.
When I told her she had to read it.
Yeah.
But a couple chapters in, she was like, "Mom, this is really good."
Yeah.
And I really felt that gave her a lot of confidence. And, it's all about, being brave about being the only one to do something.
Yeah.
And I think for teenagers, that's really important.
Yeah. I would say that Braving the Wilderness is probably one of her most, I think it's one of her better books. I mean, I think Dare to Lead, I'm a fan of, but that it really is a self-check. For sure, it's a self-check, and thank you for that. Yeah.
Some feedback. I've read several of Brené's books. I'm back to rereading Gifts of Imperfection right now. And having read through and been part of a book club that did Dare to Lead, I still got so much rich information about this. It comes back to what Brené says about it being a journey, not a destination.
That's right.
Or a checkbox.
That's right.
So having gone through all of that, trying to follow it every day or so, this still has so much value. I feel like we could get together every week and still not cover it all, still not accomplish it all. So I thank you for bravely bringing us through this today.
Oh, you're welcome. You bring up a really good point. This is an hour. So the training, Dare to Lead training, is a 24-hour curriculum. Yeah, so it is. It's intense. It really is intense. And it is a practice. So thank you for that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.